I have spent 30 years in uniform, most of those years in positions where satellite communications were not a luxury, but the operational spine of everything we did. I have watched the Gulf, the Levant, and the wider Middle East theater through every technological revolution from Desert Storm forward. Nothing in that experience prepared me for what I reviewed in classified assessments 3 days ago. Between 0340 and 0612 Zulu time on April 9th, Iranian electronic warfare systems executed a coordinated saturation jamming campaign across 11 orbital planes covering U.S. Central Command's primary satellite constellation. Approximately 280 to 310 reconnaissance drones operating across Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and the northern Arabian Sea lost uplink connectivity within a 14-minute window. Ground control stations from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar to Ali Al Salem in Kuwait reported total signal loss on 73% of their operational fleet. And Washington, for the first 6 hours, had no coherent operational picture of what had just occurred or how to restore command and control over assets worth collectively north of $4 billion. I want to be honest with you about something. When I first read the initial incident summary, my reaction was not disbelief. It was recognition. I have sat in rooms where we gamed out this exact scenario, where adversary electronic warfare capabilities mature to the point that they can deny us the electromagnetic domain we have taken for granted since 1991. The difference is this was not in a war game, not in a red team exercise, not in a theoretical construct. This happened in operational reality. And the professionalism I saw in Iranian execution, the timing, the coordination, the breadth of coverage deserves to be acknowledged not as propaganda, but as a strategic fact. In the next 35 minutes, I am going to walk you through 4 questions that every serious observer of this theater needs answered. First, how did Iran achieve simultaneous saturation jamming across multiple satellite bands without triggering early warning protocols that are supposed to detect this kind of electromagnetic aggression? Second, what specific systems did they deploy? Where were those systems positioned? And what does their operational performance tell us about the gap between our intelligence assessments and ground truth? Third, how did CENTCOM attempt to respond in the first 12 hours? And why did those responses fail to restore even partial connectivity? And fourth, what does this event mean, not just for the Middle East, but for every contested theater where American power depends on space-based infrastructure that we have assumed was untouchable? If this is the kind of analysis you have been looking for, the kind that does not soften the operational reality or manage the narrative for public consumption, subscribe to this channel and stay with me. Hit the like button. Drop your assessment in the comments section below. I read every single one. Let me walk you through what happened phase by phase because the mechanics of this operation matter. Phase 1 began at SO 340 Zulu. Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps electronic warfare units activated at least 6 high-powered jamming stations positioned across a geographic arc running from the Zagros Mountains in western Iran through concealed sites in Khuzestan province near the Iraqi border. U.S. Signals Intelligence later identified the primary system as a modified Krasuka-4 platform, originally Russian in design, but heavily adapted with indigenous Iranian components. Each station generated between 200 and 300 kilowatts of focused electromagnetic interference, targeting the X-band and K-band frequencies that U.S. military satellites use for drone command links, reconnaissance data relay, and real-time targeting information. Within 4 minutes of activation, MQ-9 Reaper drones operating over northern Iraq began reporting intermittent signal degradation. By 0348 Zulu, 17 Reapers had lost uplink entirely. Ground controllers at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, operating these aircraft via satellite relay, watched their command interfaces go dark one by one. The drones did not crash. They did not deviate from programmed flight paths. They simply became uncontrollable, frozen in autonomous holding patterns with no ability to receive new tasking, retarget sensors, or return to base on command. I want to be precise about what that means. These are not cheap quadcopters. An MQ-9 Reaper costs approximately $32 million per airframe when you include the full sensor package and ground control infrastructure. Losing command authority over 17 of them in under 10 minutes represents a roughly $540 million operational loss, not destroyed, not damaged, rendered temporarily useless. And that was just the opening minutes of Phase 1. By 0410 Zulu, the jamming effect had cascaded across the entire CENTCOM drone fleet. Smaller RQ-4 Global Hawks, each worth over $220 million, lost their primary uplink over the Persian Gulf. Tactical drones supporting ground forces in Syria went silent. Even hardened military communication satellites experienced significant signal interference on their downlink channels, degrading the quality of real-time intelligence feeds to forward operating bases across the region. The Iranian operation was not random electromagnetic noise. It was surgical. They were not jamming civilian GPS. They were not disrupting commercial Hong Kong Tongxin. They targeted the exact frequency bands and orbital planes that carry U.S. military command and control traffic. That level of specificity requires years of signals intelligence collection, detailed knowledge of U.S. satellite architecture, and probably direct or indirect Russian technical support in refining their targeting algorithms. Let me tell you something. I have briefed Congress on adversary electronic warfare programs. I have reviewed threat assessments on Iranian capabilities going back 15 years. Every single one of those assessments underestimated the speed at which Tehran was closing the technological gap. We assumed their jamming systems were regional in effective range, low power, useful for local air defense, but incapable of theater-wide saturation. That assumption was wrong. Phase 2 began at 0445 Zulu when CENTCOM attempted its first countermeasure response. Space Force operators initiated frequency hopping protocols designed to shift satellite communications onto backup channels outside the JAMS spectrum. Standard procedure. It should have restored at least partial connectivity within 12 to 18 minutes. It did not. The Iranian systems adapted in near real time, tracking the frequency shifts and adjusting their jamming output to follow. This is not 1980s technology. This is adaptive, software-defined electronic warfare that can respond faster than human operators can reconfigure their defenses. At 0503 Zulu, CENTCOM escalated to its second-tier response, rerouting drone command links through NATO satellites positioned over the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. The theory was sound. Use orbital platforms outside the Iranian jamming cone to restore connectivity from a different geometric angle. But the execution revealed a structural vulnerability we have not addressed in 2 decades of uncontested operations. The NATO satellites were never designed to handle the bandwidth load of 280-plus drones simultaneously demanding high-definition video relay and precision command links. The network immediately became oversaturated. Data throughput collapsed. Controllers regained partial contact with maybe 40 drones, but those connections were unstable, latency-heavy, and tactically useless for anything requiring real-time decision-making. I want you to understand the arithmetic here. Iran deployed an estimated 6 to 8 jamming stations. Total infrastructure cost probably under $400 million if you include years of development and Russian technical assistance. The U.S. lost operational control over assets worth more than $4 billion, rendering an entire theater's reconnaissance and strike capability temporarily blind. That is a 10-to-1 return on investment in favor of the attacker, and it exposes a dependency we have built into the entire architecture of American expeditionary warfare. Phase 3 is where the operational reality became a strategic humiliation. Between Oro 530 and Oro 612 Zulu, as CENTCOM scrambled to restore connectivity, Iranian-aligned militia forces in western Iraq and eastern Syria began repositioning heavy weapons and logistical convoys in broad daylight, fully aware that U.S. overhead reconnaissance had gone dark. We did not see them move. We did not track them. We did not interdict them. For 90 critical minutes, we were operationally blind in a theater where our entire counterterrorism and counter-Iranian strategy depends on persistent surveillance and the credible threat of immediate strike. At 0547 Zulu, a convoy of at least 22 heavy trucks crossed from Syria into Iraq near the Al-Qaim border crossing, a known infiltration route for Iranian weapons shipments into Shia militia networks. Under normal circumstances, an MQ-9 would have been overhead within 8 minutes, tracking that convoy in real time, feeding targeting data to strike cells, and presenting decision makers with the option to interdict. Instead, the convoy moved unobserved. It reached its destination. It dispersed, and by the time satellite connectivity was partially restored at Eero 618 Zulu, the operational opportunity had closed. I am not speculating about what was in those trucks. I am telling you that for the first time since Operation Inherent Resolve began, Iranian logistics networks operated with total impunity inside a U.S. surveillance zone because the surveillance infrastructure we have depended on for 30 years was temporarily neutralized by systems we did not believe Iran possessed at this level of sophistication. Phase 4 is the Washington response, or more accurately, the absence of one that meets the scale of what just occurred. In the first 12 hours after the jamming campaign, there was no public acknowledgement from the Pentagon, no readout from CENTCOM, no briefing to Congress about a theater-wide degradation of command and control. The official position, when reporters finally forced a response, was that there had been routine interference with communication systems that was quickly mitigated. That is not candor. That is narrative management designed to avoid acknowledging that an adversary we have sanctioned, isolated, and threatened for 2 decades just demonstrated the ability to temporarily blind the most technologically advanced military in human history. Let me be direct with you. I know how Washington works. I have sat in those rooms. When an operational failure this significant occurs, the first institutional reflex is not to fix the vulnerability. It is to control the story. And what I am watching right now is an interagency effort to minimize, deflect, and avoid the central question that every ally, every adversary, and every regional partner is now asking. If Iran can do this to U.S. satellite infrastructure over the Middle East, what can Russia do over the Baltics? What can China do over the Taiwan Strait? What can North Korea do over the Korean Peninsula? Stay with me, because what comes next is what actually matters for the long-term strategic picture. What happened on April 9th is not a Middle East story. It is not an Iran story. It is a global strategic shift in the vulnerability of space-based military infrastructure that every major power has been watching, planning for, and preparing to exploit. And the implications ripple far beyond one jamming incident in one theater. In Moscow, Russian military planners are studying the Iranian operation with intense professional interest. They have been developing their own satellite jamming and anti-satellite capabilities for over a decade, but what Iran just demonstrated is that you do not need to destroy satellites to neutralize them. You do not need kinetic anti-satellite missiles that create debris fields and international condemnation. You just need sophisticated electronic warfare systems positioned on the ground, generating enough focused interference to sever the command links that make those satellites operationally useful. That is a far cheaper, far more deniable, and far more scalable approach than anything we have seen in previous conflicts. For China, this event is a proof of concept. Beijing has invested billions in counterspace programs designed to hold American satellite constellations at risk in the event of a Taiwan contingency. What they just watched Iran achieve with modified Russian hardware and indigenous engineering is a validation that the U.S. military's dependence on space-based C4ISR, command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance is not an unassailable advantage. It is a systemic vulnerability that can be exploited at relatively low cost by adversaries who have spent the last 2 decades studying how we fight and where our dependencies lie. The Gulf states, U.S. security partners who have relied on American military technology and overhead reconnaissance as the backbone of their own defense planning, are now privately recalculating their assumptions. If Washington cannot guarantee persistent satellite coverage in a crisis, if Iranian jamming can temporarily blind the same systems that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others depend on for early warning and targeting support, then the value proposition of exclusive alignment with the United States decreases. We are going to see accelerated outreach to Moscow, to Beijing, and to other providers of redundant capabilities that do not rely on a single space-based architecture that just proved brittle under electronic attack. And for the broader developing world, the non-aligned states who have watched American military dominance as an unchallengeable fact of the international system since the Cold War ended, this is one more data point in a growing pattern. The unipolar moment is over. American technological superiority is not permanent, and regional powers with enough resources, enough patience, and enough external support can develop capabilities that level the playing field in specific domains, even if they cannot match U.S. military power across the board. I have said for years, in testimony, in private briefings, in conversations with colleagues still serving, that our over-reliance on vulnerable space-based infrastructure was going to be tested by adversaries who understood that you do not defeat the U.S. military in a symmetrical fight. You identify the dependencies, the enablers, the infrastructure we cannot operate without, and you target those. And when you do it effectively, you do not have to win the war. You just have to demonstrate that the cost of American intervention is higher, the risk is greater, and the outcome is less certain than the American public and American decision makers are willing to tolerate. What Iran did on April 9th was not an act of war. It was a demonstration. It was a message to Washington, to the region, and to every other actor in the international system that the electromagnetic domain is contested, that space superiority is not guaranteed, and that the infrastructure we have built our entire expeditionary model on can be temporarily neutralized by adversaries willing to invest in the right capabilities. Here is what concerns me most. This was not Iran's maximum effort. The jamming lasted less than 3 hours. They targeted one theater. They used systems we now know they possess, but have likely held in reserve for years, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. The operational question is not whether they can do this again. The question is what else they have that we have not seen yet, and whether our intelligence assessments are still underestimating their capacity to disrupt U.S. operations at the time and place of their choosing. I want to come back to a point I made earlier about the human dimension of this, because it is easy to talk about satellites and drones and jamming systems as abstract capabilities. But there are young Americans, airmen, soldiers, Marines operating in that theater who depend on those drones for overwatch, for early warning, for the intelligence that keeps them alive in contested environments. When the satellite links go dark, when the drones go silent, those men and women are more exposed, more vulnerable, and more at risk. And the families waiting for them back home deserve leaders in Washington who are willing to acknowledge that vulnerability honestly and fix it, rather than managing the public narrative to avoid uncomfortable questions. The question I want to leave you with is this: does the United States have a credible plan to operate in a contested electromagnetic environment where adversaries can temporarily deny us access to the space-based infrastructure we have depended on since 1991? Or are we still building our entire operational concept on the assumption of uncontested space dominance that no longer reflects the reality we are facing? Leave your assessment in the comments below. I read every single one. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening in that theater, share this video, hit the like button, and subscribe to this channel. The next breakdown is already in preparation, and I will see you there.